Welcome, everyone, to the Ireland America IASF Science Forum panel on science, journalism, communicating coronavirus and climate change. And for those of you who have signed in from Ireland, fáilte, tá áithiring go féidir le bheith anocht don forum seo. My name is Dr. Deborah Brosnan. I am an environment and climate scientist, also chair of the IASF board, and I've got the pleasure of hosting this event and welcoming you on behalf of the IASF. We're in the midst of a crisis, two crises, in fact, coronavirus and climate change. And coronavirus has exposed the fragility of all of our systems, especially as we struggle to deal with these major crises. It's disrupted all of our lives and the global economy. These crises have thrown science and journalism together in unprecedented ways as we seek to inform the public and build trust in the science and data that scientists are creating. And that's the focus of our forum tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation on this topic. Before we launch straight into it, I first want to thank our sponsors in DC, the Embassy of Ireland in Washington, DC, Deborah Brosnan and Associates, for co-sponsoring this event. Now, Ambassador Mulhall, the Ireland's ambassador to the US, wanted to say a few words of welcome to all our guests on either side of the Atlantic. Unfortunately, he's been called away for a ministerial meeting. And in his stead, Harry Lester, who is Councillor for Trade, Investment and Innovation, will give the Embassy's welcome message. Harry, over to you. Hello, Harry, are you there? Harry, can you hear us? On mute.
I'm sorry, Deborah, I don't know if you can hear me. The connection here is terrible.
We have you now, so go right ahead. Go right ahead, Harry, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead. Hopefully you can hear me. As you say, Deborah, Ambassador Mulhall very much wanted to be here today, but he's caught up in another event, and we're just coming off the back of a two-day visit in person from Minister Coveney, which went very well. But as you know, he and the Embassy are very supportive of the work of the Irish American Science Forum, and delighted to be involved with this event. As some of you are aware, Ireland has been on a very, very impressive journey over the last 20 years as we've invested more in research, development and innovation. So coming from a very low base in the early 2000s, and before that, we have systematically invested in very specific priority areas that a small country like Ireland can add real value to. And it's had a profound impact. We've gone up the global rankings to, I think, 12th currently in excellence in science. And also more recently, we're ranked first in immunology and knowledge diffusion, which is obviously hugely important at a time like this. We've got incredibly strong links. We enjoy incredibly strong links through research partnerships between the US and Ireland. Indeed, the Science Foundation Ireland and the National Science Foundation, upon which SFI is based on, have a very close working relationship, which has been hugely fruitful for us. But also from the diplomatic side, we have Science Foundation Ireland have posted a staff member who worked very, very closely with our consulate in San Francisco. Our consulate in Boston is currently recruiting for a scientific advisor to help with their work, given the huge life sciences community there. And here in DC, we now have a specific dedicated resource to spend specific time on the research, development and innovation agenda in the embassy. So just to say, I'm very, very much looking forward to the webinar today, particularly timely and relevant as we look at journalism and the challenge in communicating science-based information in existential issues of climate change and the coronavirus. So just to add our support, our delight at being involved, and yeah, looking forward to this very, very interesting topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Harry, and thank you to the Embassy. We really appreciate the support that you've given us through all this time, and we're very excited about what's happening in science in Ireland and the connection between Ireland and the US. So jumping right into today's topic, science has been predicting climate change for at least 30 years, and scientists have been studying it for longer than that. We've also been predicting the emergence of zoonotic diseases like coronavirus, and indeed we had some early warnings really with the SARS and with Ebola, but yet here we are. And our world is becoming increasingly divided, publicly divided, between those who listen to reason and favor reason, and those who may believe that coronavirus or climate change is a hoax. And yet, at the same time, for scientists like us, particularly through coronavirus and also climate change, this is an unprecedented time. The rapid expansion of science and knowledge we're gaining, particularly of coronavirus, is unprecedented. The way scientists are working together is completely new and extraordinary. And many scientists, many of my colleagues, are baffled as to why this is not being communicated in the world and why we're not listening to it, or why the public isn't listening and politicians seem to be making decisions without science. As a result, I think journalists who are reporting on science and scientists find themselves tossed into the same fray in ways they've never been put together before, as we're each seeking to report on what's happening, let the public know what's going on, and try and rebuild trust in science and data. And that is the topic we'll be talking about today with three very distinguished and exciting guests that I'm very pleased to introduce. The first is Dr. Rita Colwell. Rita is a distinguished professor at University of Maryland. She is the former director of the National Science Foundation, former board member of Science Foundation Ireland, Ireland America Science Forum, recipient of many distinguished and well-deserved awards. And I've had the pleasure to work with Rita through IASF, as well as some work we did together on doing science during crisis, which is exactly what we're doing now. Welcome, Rita. Secondly, Mr. Brian O'Donovan.
Thank you.
Brian is Ireland's man in DC, Ireland's man in America. Journalist, senior correspondent for RTE in Washington, and he has a unique perspective because he's working both in Ireland and seeing what's happening in the US, both in coronavirus and climate change, and he brings that unique binational perspective that I'm looking forward to hear about. Welcome, Brian. And then Andrew Revkin. Andy was a former journalist in climate and environment for the New York Times, is now the founding director of the Center for Innovation and Sustainability and Communication and Sustainability, at Columbia University Earth Institute. Andy and I have discussed hazards and climate change for many years, and he's published some amazing reports on it. And I've been pleased to be a guest on his Sustain What, the program that he's running regularly out of Columbia University online, and I would encourage you to tune in. He's got some amazing guests. Welcome, Andy. So,
great to be here.
I'm starting this by, I've asked each of our guests to talk for 5 minutes on their perspective on this topic of science journalism, communication of science. Where are we actually on the science? Where are we in building trust? And I'm going to start with Dr. Correspondent. Rita, over to you.
Well, thank you, Deborah. As you heard from Councillor Lester, science has really Ireland to the very top in the competition and in the benefits of science, engineering, technology, mathematics, and medicine. It's very ironic. At the same time, there is this turning away from science, actually discrediting and discounting it. But the irony is that at the same time, the information that comes out from the coronavirus is absorbed intensively by the public. What we have learned in a very short time, perhaps 6 or 7 months, first of all, we've sequenced the virus in January. Now we have, when I say we, I mean globally, not just the US or Ireland, but globally. We've sequenced more than 400 strains of the virus. We've learned that there are variants. We learned how it attacks the human body in very devious and multiple ways, not just the lungs, but the heart, the kidney, the liver, and even the brain. We've learned all this. In a short time, we've also learned that there are certain treatments that help in the most severe cases of the COVID-19. We haven't yet come to a vaccine, but we have a half a dozen quite full experimental vaccines that are being developed and we're moving rapidly. Now, all of these developments appear in the press, and they are really absorbed by the general public. The public now understands the symptoms, understands the fact that you can excrete the virus when you don't have symptoms. You can, that is, just as you're being infected, to the point where you demonstrate symptoms. At that point, you have still been secreting the virus, releasing it in the feces. And we've also learned that once your for the presence of the virus is negative, you still may be releasing virus in the stool, which has led to understanding that we can actually test wastewaters and sewage in cities and for communities and hospitals and dormitories specifically, and we can get at least a week heads up as to whether or not there are cases. Now, all of this has occurred in a very, very short time. It's been incredible what we have been able to disseminate to the public. The public has absorbed it, they understand it, but at the same time, there's this kind of negativity. And I think that is because we as scientists try to turn everyone else into a scientist. And I think it behooves us to understand that we need to explain how the scientific method works. The fact that you really need controls, you need carefully designed experiments to prove a given point, a hypothesis. For example, in the case of a vaccine, you have to establish testing protocols that allow you to be able to statistically significantly say at the end of the test period that it's safe, and that it's effective, and that it can be disseminated effectively. For example, one of the vaccines presently requires a minus 80 degree storage unit between the virus preparation and delivery. That's an impediment. So the point I would like to make is that if we could explain, and if we could have in our explanation a sharing of information rather than speaking from the mount, the scientist, giving the information to the lay public, if in fact we were to discuss and converse and find a way to show the excitement, the discoveries that are made, how they're beneficial. And in fact, it's really understanding nature and how it works. And one last point that I will make, and that is science is really interdisciplinary. Right now, I've described the discoveries that have been made. Some have been made, the vaccine developments, for example, by molecular geneticists, virologists working in the laboratory. Other discoveries are made by physicians working in the field, understanding the symptoms and the patient's responses to various treatments, etc. Others discoveries have been made by the workers in the water treatment plants, the sewage treatment plants. And then there are the social behavioral scientists who have taught us how to deliver effectively vaccines so that they're accepted. And I think this indicates that it's not just a scientist working in the laboratory, but it's the entire community. And then the economics, the behavioral aspects, and the international aspects. We now are in a global pandemic, and science works internationally. And I think a solution clearly will come from partnership, collaborations, sharing, and forging together into the discoveries in science. So those are my comments to sort of start the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rita. That was really interesting. I want to come back to your comment on scientist is trying to make everybody into a scientist. I think that's a really important point, and I want to come back to it in terms of how we engage with the world. At this point, Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you, please.
Hi, everybody, and thanks for having me on. As Deborah said, my name is Brian O'Donovan. I'm the Washington correspondent with RTE, and one of the biggest parts of your job as Washington correspondent is to cover the White House. And the busiest and biggest year of your 4-year posting will be election year. So at the start of this year, 2020, I had a very clear vision in my head of what I thought the year would look like. It would be campaign rallies, it would be big debates, it would be conventions, it would be a big election. I had no idea that the year would have me talking about a little-known anti-malaria drug called hydroxychloroquine, or interviewing infectious disease experts by the name of Dr. Anthony Fauci, who's become a household name. The coronavirus has completely turned this year on its head. It has resulted in, as we know, this massive pandemic, and it has absolutely come front and center into politics and into this election. And you look at Donald Trump, you look at his evolution, if you will, when it comes to the coronavirus. At the start of this pandemic, back in February, he was telling us it was just a little flu, nothing to be worried about, it was going to go away. Bob Woodward's new book, Rage, showed us, however, that Donald Trump actually knew a lot more about the science back then, a lot more than he was letting on. And I think throughout Donald Trump's handling of the virus, which has been my job for the year, covering his reaction to all of this, we've seen this constant obsession with reopening things, reopening the economy, getting things back up into gear again, and questioning the science and questioning his own scientific experts. And we will all remember that infamous moment when he stood up at the podium at the White House and spoke about the ingesting of bleach or various other strange cures and fixes and potions, constantly looking for the quick fix. And I remember covering that night when he spoke about bleach and the camera panned over to his science expert, another Dr. Deborah Birx, and you could see her face turn, and this almost cringe moment. There he was up on the stage putting out these suggestions of quick fixes and quick cures. I also think what we've seen from Donald Trump over the course of this year is sometimes taking the science and using it to suit himself, and almost manipulating the science and manipulating the scientists. He has a new scientist on his Corona task force briefing, Dr. Scott Atlas, who is a neuroradiologist. He's not an infectious disease expert. He's the new guy really advising Donald Trump. And a lot of what he says suits Donald Trump. He questions mask wearing, he questions immunity in children, and he questions the whole concept of herd immunity, which goes against most of the rest of his experts. And there was a controversial story here in the last few days where Dr. Robert Redfield, the head of the Centers for Disease Control here in the US, was overheard having a phone conversation on a plane where he was giving out about Dr. Scott Atlas. And that's what we've seen from Donald Trump, that he, as I say, he will take a suggestion, he will take a hypothesis,
Brian, I think you've frozen on us. Okay, well,
I hope you
Brian,
haven't been cut off.
Brian, no, it was a very opportune moment, or not, but you've just frozen. So while you're coming back in, maybe Andy, we can turn over to you to lead off.
Sure.
Yeah,
sure.
yeah.
I'm sure he'll come back. So yeah, the key to the question right now that we're discussing is the word crisis. I think science communication has always been challenging because uncertainty, which is a keystone in science, delineating how much we don't know is an important part of knowing where to go and what to do, is a very hard concept for the public. And then you have risk. We have a really hard time with longer timescale risks with things that don't directly affect us. And when you think about public health in the context of the pandemic, it's really hard for people sometimes to wrap their heads around public health. You know that by washing your hands and putting on a mask, you might be preventing your own risk level from rising. But how do you understand the benefit of that to the wider public is a harder thing. And some of our, Rita, the issues that she's dealt with over the decades too include dispersed levels of pollutants and the like that can have a big effect on a community. So they're huge challenges. But then now in a crisis, there's a whole body of behavioral science and social science that shows that essentially a crisis tends to make you more of who you were. tends to make you gravitate more to your cultural group, the people you identify with. And that has led to a lot of the divisions we've seen. And again, this is not just unique to the United States, as we've seen. There was a horrific headline in the Times of London a month or so ago. A columnist talked about anti-mask Nazis, or mask, that there is a Nazism to the enforcing masks upon people. And this stuff, it drives us all who are focused on conveying stories that can meaningfully improve the progress on things like the pandemic or climate change. It kind of makes your hair catch on fire. But it tends to be in situations like the current one, especially where you have more than one stressor. It's not just the pandemic. It's not just the wildfires in California. It's the information environment is designed almost to stress us. And that's a new feature. Back in the old days, the 1980s, I wrote magazine stories. This is my 1988 article about global warming. And back then it was very much a one-way street. I wrote a story, readers read it. The television news conveyed, the national, Walter Cronkite would convey in the United States that, the news of the night. He would say, that's the way it is. And we all sat there eating our supper and listening to the way it was from maybe 3 purveyors of information. And now in the online environment, there's a zillion purveyors of information. And again, depending on your bias, depending on who you identify as, and this is abortion, nuclear power versus renewables, 5G, as we've seen, even 5G towers being incinerated or toppled for fear of pandemic. You tend to retreat into your condition. You tend to find sources of information that suit you. And that really changed me as a journalist. I went away from thinking that this was the most important use of my time to what can we all do to foster a more general capacity, one, to appreciate the difference between reality and fantasy, including assessing our own predispositions, stepping back from your own thinking and saying, do I really know this, or am I just feeling this because it feels like my tribe? And that's as valid for liberals as it is for others. The other is, what can I do to spread information or insights that are more useful? And with all the frustrations in the current media environment, and it's full of noise, it's still designed, Facebook and YouTube and Google are all designed to validate you or infuriate you. And it's actually a mix. It's not just validation. So if you don't understand that you're being hijacked every moment of every day by the way a tweet is designed, by the way the little blue check happens, by the way Facebook likes pour in, by the way our kids on Instagram are constantly looking for signals and feedback from their peers. If that's not something you're aware of, then you end up being dragged really in the worst possible direction, down toward division, toward suspicion, toward sectoral relationships to information. And then, but on the other side, you see, this is what I'm doing at Columbia now, at the Earth Institute, trying to highlight examples that cut the other way, like what you're doing right here now. This can be shared subsequently or right now with others and create conversations. Johns Hopkins University, one of the most amazing examples of diving into the morass came in around January 20th, when 2 applied engineering researchers at Johns Hopkins saw a tweet from a public health scientist really worried about what was going on in Wuhan, and they set up what's now a universally probed tracker website, the Johns Hopkins COVID-19 tracker map. That happened overnight, and it's gotten literally billions with a B, billions of views. And it evolved, and it came about because 2 people had the capacity to build the website, and then you iterate, you keep working at it, make it a little better. And there are many examples like that I've seen. People have dived into teaching. As teaching was locked off out of the classroom, you see great innovations happening. And then, what can you do to spread those? The way forward in a crisis environment on issues like COVID-19 or climate is to me, is more about boosting the capacity to hold meaningful conversations and get information where it's needed than it is about doing more of this. So that doesn't mean that, the nightly news doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that conventional journalism doesn't matter. It just means that there's much more to do. And I think the pathways to success for scale especially are very different than they were back 20 or 30 years ago.
Thank you, Andy. This is really fascinating, but in terms of listening to your own transformation as a journalist, and it actually almost mirrors some of the scientific journeys that Rita spoke about and you and I have spoken about that we've been on. And I want to come back to that. Brian, welcome back. Communication is what it is. We're talking about communication, so here we go. I'll let you give you some time to finish there because you were on a fascinating topic. So please go ahead.
Yeah. And apologies for losing my link. I've absolutely no idea what happened there. I mean, I'll just finish the point I was making at the time when my system crashed, whatever went wrong with it, was Donald Trump and the whole issue of mask wearing, and that mask wearing has become this big, almost political thing here now. The Trump supporters won't wear the mask. You know, you go to a Democrat event, you're maybe a little more likely to see mask wearing. It's also, so it's political. I think it's also geographical. I have found it very interesting here in the US, where I am in Washington, DC, an awful lot of mask wearing. You go maybe somewhere like Georgia, Florida, Texas, less so. And I think when it comes to the science and it comes to the messaging, there's definitely a from the top down approach. We hear Donald Trump flip-flopping on mask wearing, sometimes mocking his opponent, Joe Biden, for mask wearing. And I see that when I go out and about, and as part of my job to interview Trump supporters at a Trump rally, you won't see a lot of them wearing masks. And I will be wearing a mask, and I've had instances where they question me and they said, "Why are you wearing that mask? That's not going to do you any good." And I said, "Well, the idea of the mask is that I don't spread it to you." And they shrug their shoulders and they will dismiss it. And they will say that the COVID-19 is not as bad as the media and the scientists are telling us, and a mask isn't going to protect you, and it's all made up and it's all an invention. And we don't think it's as bad as being put out there. So I just think it's the importance of communicating the science in a way, but as we've seen, some people out there can take the science, manipulate it, use it in their own ends, and that can have a very damaging and worrying effect because it does trickle down and it does seep into those who follow them.
Great, thank you, Brian. I think that's it's really a very important, actually from all of you, a very important set of topics and discussions. Before we launch into the discussion, I want to let people know that if they want to ask a question, there is a place to ask a question on your screen, or you can send an email. I think we can put up the email address if you prefer to do it that way, and we will ask you questions as we go through. I want to jump into a comment that I come back to, I think, what everybody's made, and Rita and Brian and Andy, you said the same thing in quite a different way, which is, I think for us as scientists, many of us felt like what we really need to do was communicate better, tell a better story, tell our science more. And I'm not sure that this is exactly the right way we're going about it. And I want to share kind of a climate change example and something from the work we've done. At one point, we were asked to help with an endangered species, that listing of which had changed forestry practices throughout California and the entire West Coast. And it pitted scientific data against jobs, against economic losses. And the initial thing was to go in and say, well, here's the science, here's what it says. But what we decided to do was bring in the scientists with the public and with the affected communities. And the scientists literally debated the science in front of the public. And they argued about the uncertainty of the data, the strength of the knowledge. And one scientist from New York stood up and gave a presentation on extinction risks. He'd done this modeling, used the best data, and he ended it by saying, look, I think this is the best model that's out there, but the data are weak, and you should use it as a guide, not as definitive. Now, everybody in that audience could have gone, well, that was a great waste of money. Instead, what it did was it made people understand how science is done. And the people in the audience started to think about how to practically fill in those gaps. What is it that they could do themselves in order to help bring this bird back from extinction or help sustain the forest? And it was a game changer for me to understand how people began to appreciate what science was and what it wasn't, and how they were part of the debate. And I'd like to get from each of you how we can do this more, because I think this is one way, but I don't think it's the only way. And I think journalists have a role in this too. It's not just scientists. So I'll Any of you would like to jump in, please do.
I'll just
Rita.
say that.
Rita, go first.
Yeah, I'll just say that the colloquial saying is that all politics are local. I'd like to say that all science is local. And I think that communicating science to the community, to the Kiwanis Club, to the local chambers of commerce, speaking at the lunches, interacting and involving the lay public in the deliberations. I mean, not as a mass kind of thing, but being certain to invite the community for whom the science that is being carried out will have the greatest benefit or the potential adverse effect, but having them part of the discussion, as you've just pointed out, having them part of seeing how the science is done is really critical. I think one of the problems, and actually the comment about Trump looking for a magic cure, I don't think what is understood, for example, laser surgery, which is so beneficial, particularly for eye surgery, that was now 30 years ago. It was Charlie Townsend, who later got a Nobel Prize, who was mucking around in the laboratory looking at this interesting new phenomenon. And it was actually subsequent work when a graduate student was looking and aligning the beam, and the beam hit him in the eye, and they rushed him to the hospital, and the surgeon at the hospital said, this is very interesting. It's a perfect, nice hole. The eye is fine. Maybe this could have some application. And that literally is how from there it went on to application for laser surgery. Now, you didn't get that overnight, but this was a process of fundamental physics that led to findings, discoveries, some accidental, but just understanding this process, I think, is what we need to convey rather than just shouting about sudden discoveries.
Oh boy, I couldn't agree more with that. I've said many times that to me it feels better if I had to choose between people learning the facts of science, like what's the structure of DNA, versus the process of science, meaning how science works. I would go with the B every time, because the way you build an understanding, appreciation for the results is through knowing that it's a journey. And also the other thing that illuminates is that when scientists disagree about something, like the latest data on an ice sheet in Greenland, at least the serious ones, the fact that they're fighting over it is how science works. It's actually the process of science. That argumentation, sort of testing ideas, is the way it moves forward. And then the more people have comfort zone around that, the less likely they are to say, oh, scientists disagree, therefore we shouldn't do anything. And that relates to what we were saying earlier about uncertainty as well. So that I think what Rita is saying is one of the processes for sure, telling those stories, making sure people are not, when a Nobel Prize is granted, that it's not just, some aging Swiss guy just got an award. Like the LED is the same thing. It was about 25 years of, at least, of work toward the insights that garnered 2 or 3 people the Nobel Prize in Physics for light emitting diodes. And you look at virtually everything, photovoltaics, everything around us has a story behind it. And that's part of education, would be to reveal those stories more. Just looking at, you could look on Google, if you're looking at something, you could see where it came from. That would be kind of cool. So that's the way forward, I think. One way forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think the whole concept of timing and process is where politics and science collides. Yeah. Donald Trump wants the fix now. He wants the vaccine now. He particularly wants the vaccine in the next month so he can announce it before the election. And he has said this. He has said, we're going to have something before November. And you can be damn sure he will announce something before November. No, it's something maybe that he's already announced, or that isn't really conclusive, or something that he can take back afterwards if he has won the election. And that's the conundrum that faces him. His whole issue at the moment, and his whole campaign at the moment to get a coronavirus vaccine, is called Operation Warp Speed, and pushing it through as fast as he can. And this is where he clashes with his own scientists, some of whom talking about how, well, no, it's not a good thing to rush these things, and you have wider issues if you end up coming up with this fix too quickly. And as well, Deborah, just to come back to, I was interested to note that your analogy that you were talking about, the endangered species, forests, California, that of course, again, is something that we have seen a big focus on in recent weeks, the clash between the science and the politics, and Donald Trump giving out to the Californians for not sweeping up the leaves and not taking away the dead trees. And this is the fault of the local authorities, and it is not the fault of climate change. And again, this was an easy attack for him. These were Democrats, a Democrat-controlled state that he's not going to win anyway in November, that he doesn't particularly care about. So an easy way to attack, and we will see this with the current US president. He likes to play the blame game. The coronavirus is not my fault, it is China's fault. Forest fires are not my fault, it is the fault of the local authorities for not sweeping up the leaves. So again, we come back to this concept of taking the science, using the bits of it that suit him, ignoring the bits that don't, and again, coming back to that earlier point of the timing issue and pushing and pushing and pushing for an end to this, which of course we all want, but he is more eager than most to get there because it is of electoral benefit for him if he can hold something up before election and say, look, I have a fix for this awful, awful pandemic.
Well, just one point I would make is that most of the trees are on federal lands, which
That's right.
Good point. Yes, exactly. It's not, yeah. And he doesn't, actually, if it's about sweeping up the leaves and the trees, it's your fault. Yeah.
right.
And it's not all forest. A lot of it is grassland too.
That's
So,
right.
yeah, exactly. So, Brian, I think that's, your point is well taken. And I think a lot of the public feel a little the same, which is, we're now coming into September, and I think everybody, all of ourselves included, we're going through this process together, and we're like, oh, well, it'd be nice if it was over. And even as scientists, even though we're working on it and we understand that it's going to take time to fully understand it, to develop the vaccine, we're still human, we're still part of our community, and we would like to have this be over quickly. You're dealing, Brian, with you're interviewing the public more than many of us. How do we communicate to the public better that this is a process, and avoid, exactly what you talked about? We turn on the TV and it's, it's somebody's fault. There's a blame game going on, and how do we avoid that? And how do we help you and people like you and Andy build that public trust or give you the information?
I actually have to say, I think the scientific community has done an excellent job in the communication message. I mentioned at the start, Dr. Anthony Fauci has become a household name. He's a celebrity now. Dr. Deborah Birx, a household name. Back in Ireland, Dr. Tony Holohan, the chief medical officer, a household name. His replacement right now, Dr. Ronan Glynn. These guys go out every night on the TV screens and explain the position. And now we all know about R numbers and spread and the shape of the virus and how it works. I think the science has done a really good job in the communication message. It makes it easier for us journalists then to distribute it. The complication comes when you bring politics into it, when you bring economics into it. Look, in an ideal world, we'd shut everything down, wait for a vaccine, and reopen up everything in 3, 4, 5 years' time. Great. But in the meantime, you've decimated everything. There's no economy. Politicians aren't getting reelected. So you have to, the balancing act is, how do you take the science and then make it meld with society, with life, with politics, with economics? That's where we're clashing. I don't think the messaging is a problem. I think the messaging has been quite strong. It's been quite clear. The problem is when person X is telling you to socially distance and wear a mask and don't reopen your bars and don't reopen your shops, but state Y is doing all of these things, and we're seeing these increases. And then within that, again, as I spoke to at the start, we have a certain people with certain political beliefs who see what their leaders are telling them, and they won't listen to Dr. Birx or Dr. Fauci. They would much prefer to listen to Donald Trump and follow his advice instead.
I think a part of, maybe I'm naive, but I think a problem is, for example, the vaccine. How to get a vaccine, it's really a long process, and the fact that we've done so much in such a short time is amazing. First of all, the sequence, we had to isolate the virus and ensure that was the virus causing the infection. Then we sequenced the nucleic acid, the ribonucleic acid of the virus. That tells us what the gene's functions may be. That gives us an opportunity then to figure out a way to interpret that for protection which means that we then use the isolated virus to test on cell lines. These are cultures of tissue cells and heart cells. And that, if we can replicate and get the virus to be able to grow, then we can use it for further experiments. In other words, there's a whole series of steps that are involved in vaccine, culminating eventually when you have tested it in animals, most like humans, that were without any adverse effects, without heart attacks or whatever, and then being able to test it in a population to ensure that there is no adverse effects. This is a long time scale, which we have compressed in months, but I think if it's understood, there would be less of this rush to simply get something to inject into everybody. Do I have it wrong? Because you're the professional communicators. I'm just a scientist.
Well, I think having dealt with some early situations, like after 9/11, the World Trade Center attacks, the dust in the air was creating terrible fears. And politicians, as we've heard here already, are not just Donald Trump. This was Mayor Giuliani, Governor Pataki, and others were very quick to try to assuage public fears and getting ahead of the evidence. And there's always this disconnect between the political need for urgent answers and the fundamental nature of scientific inquiry. And what has to happen, I think, is just more clarity. I think, Fauci has been pretty good about, after the fact, he's been pretty good about explaining, like on masks. He said, yeah, we did have a different view. At that time, the evidence was different. But at the time, I think that's right at the early stages when you say, you don't need to worry about masks. That was the way the WHO put that out, I think, was mistaken. They didn't really characterize it well enough to say, we don't know yet. There's a general principle that if you put on a mask, you're less likely to. There are general understandings about some things that could have been conveyed, I think, differently. And then what happens after the fact is you end up with this blame game. Well, you said back then we didn't need them. And it gets to be this morass of interlinked arguments. But in the early stages of a crisis, I think it's a crucial moment where you either win or lose the capacity to have people behave in a reasonable way, even as you say, we don't know all the answers yet.
The interesting thing is, Andy, is that we did not know how powerful the mode of transmission of aerosols was.
Right, whether it was surfaces or the air, et cetera.
Because the assumption was there were only large droplets. We now know that these small droplets can carry for 25 feet or longer, maybe even be airborne.
And at that time, too, the real concern was shortages of the N95 masks. Exactly. But again, even then, it could have been said, I think it was said pretty much, there's a shortage of these masks. The public doesn't need them. But that doesn't mean the public should go around coughing on each other. So there had...
And I think you hit it as well. It's almost, I think, up the pressure on the scientist to get it right. And I do feel for Dr. Fauci sometimes that Donald Trump will go back to his early statements. Dr. Fauci didn't even know. Look, he said this, and then this person said this, and this person, and that's what we're going with. I think that's maybe the communication challenge for the scientists to say this is an evolution. We didn't know this back then. Now we know this. Forgive what was said back in February, March. We didn't know it. But again, for political purposes, some will latch on to an old statement and an original statement and say, look, even the experts are wrong.
And I think that's true, Brian. I think for scientists listening to you, what you're describing is a scientific process. I have papers that I wrote when I was a grad student, and then I wrote papers afterwards, and I went back to what I wrote, and I almost started by saying, at one time I said this. This is before I ran my experiment for several more years. And now, based on that, my results have changed. And if my results aren't changing, then the science is resolved. It's not an interesting question to science. So I think this constant evolution of knowledge is to scientists the mark of good science and the mark of scientific progress. Whereas, as you're describing, for the general public, it can come across as confusion or disagreement.
There's a rule of thumb that I learned from Ken Caldera, who's a climate scientist. He studied philosophy as an undergraduate, minored in it, and he said David Hume, a couple centuries ago, stressed that the importance of distinguishing an ought, the word ought, you ought to do something, from
Uh-huh.
is and ought. You can't get an ought from an is. Science is the is part. And it led me to constantly tell my friends who are scientists, and I think journalists also, when you have your personal biases, right? I think global warming is going to be dangerous. But what he said is you split it into two sentences. So I'm a scientist. I study sea ice on the Arctic Ocean. It's going away. I'm also a father and a voter or whatever, and I think we need to do this thing. And that way you're distinguishing the activity you do as a scientist from, that doesn't necessarily give you a special privilege to say we need to pursue all renewables or nuclear power or a carbon tax. Those are very different socially wider questions. And so that simple thing, a 2-sentence rule, the pandemic is a bunch of things happening. I think we ought to do X is a different thing.
Which really comes back to the concept of science as a scientist as a citizen. We happen to have a particularly unique knowledge, just as journalists have, just as, whether it's people working in the forests of California have. And we bring that knowledge to the table. And I think it's almost the social structure that we set up that allows us to have that dialogue. And I feel like that's missing in coronavirus. I think it's missing in climate change too, but I think coronavirus is really heightening this lack of community that we have, that scientists are part of, and other disciplines.
One thing I'd point to, and I'm sure Brian has seen this, so maybe Rita too, like on Twitter now, this pretty big army of epidemiologists and virologists and who've suddenly become Twitter stars are engaging with the public, not always in a finger wagging way. Some are a little too, you idiots, they're too aggressive. But there are others, they've learned how to engage on these tough questions around the pandemic, like going back to school. That's a really tough question. There's no easy answers. And so that's a process of engagement. As long as there's listening involved, as long as that can be really valuable and it can be scalable also.
I was along those lines. I was listening to a presentation. It might have been in one of your panels, Andy, of somebody who studies social media, and was talking about when Zika was a big issue in Brazil for the Olympics, and there was a lot of misinformation going around on Twitter and all the social media, and the government engaged and encouraged scientists to get into the social media chat rooms, which I'll be honest, most scientists avoid like the plague. In order to engage with these groups that were spreading misinformation. And often they were spreading it because it was the only information they had. And they thought they were doing a favor or, getting more likes. And apparently it turned out to be really effective of, just scientists engaging with this general public that they would never normally have met. And I thought that was fascinating. And it sounds like it's happening naturally now with what you're saying. Yeah.
And I mean, social media just adds that whole other layer as well, of course. What you publish in your newspaper, what you put out in your radio station or your TV station is controlled and regulated. We have rules. We won't put out wackos. We won't put out people with mad conspiracy theories. You can't control that on social media. And that's not just true for scientific news, it's true for all news out there. And it's a huge, huge problem right now. And we are most definitely seeing it with coronavirus. We have seen it in the past with other science deniers, climate deniers, be it MMR linked to autism, be it whatever else you're having. It still exists out there, and it has found a home on your Facebook and your Twitters, and it's much easier to disseminate, it's much easier to spread, because it was traditional media long ago, and Andy, I'm sure you've experienced this, shut that thing down. We would not put those people on our air or put them in our newspaper because their theories are too out there and too wacky. Unfortunately, internet media, social media has allowed these conspiracy theories to spread like wildfire. Pardon.
Yeah, it's
terrible. And it seems like science needs to get in and be, spreading itself into these different chat rooms, which is part of the focus, right? You want to get out of your tribe and into another tribe. That's how the messages are spread. I want to change gear just a little bit, because we had Ronan Kelly. I want to come back to uncertainty a little bit here. So Ronan Kelly sent something in basically saying many disciplines such as property insurance deal with uncertainty, and the public better accepts this. Is there an opportunity to improve communications through an interdisciplinary approach? And I want to take thank you first, Brosnan, for putting that in. I want to take that a little bit, because in the field of climate change, in the area I work, I'm often talking about nature-based solutions, the value of coral reefs, value of sand dunes, the value of oyster reefs, marshes. And I can show this, I can demonstrate it, but when I can explain to somebody that in order to restore a marsh or a sand dune, first it will cost them less money. In some cases, we've saved $500,000 and $1 million for people. They will be better protected against storm surge. And when the storm hits, they will have less damage and the natural system will have protected them. We had a case where after Hurricane Irma, a sand dune we had rebuilt literally held the line, and the insurance person came in, adjuster, and said, had you not built that dune, you would have had $100 million worth of damage. That got everybody's attention. Now, where I'm going with this and with coronavirus is we talk about the science, we talk about the public health. I wear a mask, as you were saying, Brian, so that you're protected. Yet a lot of people are looking at an economic issue. They're losing their jobs, small businesses are going down. And I hate to bring this up, but I think it's important. Is there a message in there that we can communicate? Because if people are losing their jobs, and we can explain why wearing a mask, for instance, by wearing a mask, we will slow down the spread, and ultimately, we will be able to allow small businesses to persist. We will help people who are struggling economically.
Yeah, I think that's a very good way of looking at it, because right now people are seeing this, black and white. You are shutting me down. I had to shut down my bar, my restaurant. This is a problem. But yes, if you could communicate that, okay, by the shutting down, we are buying time, we are controlling this thing, and in the long term, all will improve. And you make an interesting point about the insurers, and of course, this has been spoken about at length in California, where homeowners build in areas where many years ago you didn't build because it was too close to the forest, and these terrible forest fires came through and destroyed everything. And one of the big problems now is that there's such a demand for housing in California that people have built in areas where they would not have built in the past and maybe should not be building now. Mm-hmm. And then the natural solution there may well be the home insurers turning around and saying, well, we're not insuring your property. You can rebuild it. I'll give you the money this time, but you will not get insurance again. Your property will therefore be worthless. And then eventually there's the trickle-down effect that people won't build in these areas anymore. But as we know in the California case, and people, a bit more information, you can correct me, am I right in saying the governor intervened and told all the insurance companies in California that they had to give the homeowners 4 years of insurance? Yeah. And that's right now. So that's probably going to have a big impact, is it not, on that whole concept of building. At the end of the day, it'll be the dollar. It'll be the insurance company that will decide you're not building here anymore.
Yeah,
there are other layers to that too. In many cases, there's some pretty limited government conservative groups that are as unhappy about people building in harm's way as those who worry about climate change or whatever. The Headwaters Economics is a long-standing think tank in the West that's free market oriented, but they say you have to look at all the subsidies, and it's not just insurance. For example, in Colorado, I wrote about this almost 10 years ago. There was big fires, and it turns local communities hardly pay any of the cost of firefighting. So if the federal government is there to come in and bail you out by bringing in hundreds of millions of dollars worth of firefighting effort every year, and your local community is not on the hook for that, then of course you'll be less apt to have zoning or building codes that would be restrictive. And so it's insurance is one, but it would be great if we have a way to map or just really identify with transparency all these different incentives from the local to the national level that are building this pressure. And this is coastal regions even more so. It's the same thing with flood insurance. You know, Republicans and Democrats actually once agreed 2012 or so on rationalizing the cost of flood insurance. And that was an unbelievable achievement. But then Democratic and Republican voters who were homeowners said, "Oh my God, our insurance rates are going up," and they rolled back the bill. So it's like the political realities seem to always, I dare say, use the word Trump to trump the.
Although it is changing. There are parts of Florida where climate change is driving insurance prices and whether you can get it. So we are seeing some of that, and I'm just wondering if we can, even as scientists, make the economic argument for people that are hurting economically.
I think the point that should be made is that science should not be left just scientists are part of the community, and every person is really a scientist. For example, you made a point yourself, Deborah, about including the lay groups. Let's take the example of global warming. If you're a bird watcher, and if you watch the fledging year after year of, let's say, eagles on the Potomac River, and you notice that they're fledging a month earlier, and if you've been keeping records, as these very avid bird watchers do, that is science. And if we incorporate those kinds of activities, people themselves understand what's happening. In Miami, you don't really have to argue about sea level rise, because every month with the highest tide, you're wading around the main street of Miami in your boots, as I'm told. So if you as a citizen are participating in measuring these effects, then you become a convert in the sense that you are now a scientist, as you always have been.
There's one model I want to draw attention to that I think has great value beyond its limits so far. The American Geophysical Union, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, created something called Thriving Earth Exchange. The website, the website is thrivingearthexchange.org, and it's like Match.com for communities facing chronic flooding or erosion or landslide risk, to find a hydrologist or a geologist who can help them. And what I've heard over and over again is that it's the conversation, it's the interactivity, and particularly it's the idea that the scientist is coming to help them with a problem that they see, not scientists coming in and saying, you need to do X. That makes a huge difference. And so when I think about other models for even the National Academies, I'm on a committee there, and they go to the Hill, Congress sometimes, and they do briefings, but it's mostly the briefings, frankly, are here's some neat science about climate change. It's not like, hey, let's see which congressional districts have flood risk. Let's go and offer them the idea of doing a regional or flood risk congressional network briefing. It's still too much expository. Like my old stories, it's too much like waving a front page story in someone's face as opposed to what can we do for you? I think that's something that could change.
Exactly.
And that might actually address the question that came in, which is, from Gerald Cagle. I'm sorry I'm not getting to everybody's questions or emails, but I'll send them out later. It basically said, what do we do about the people who who believe in conspiracy theories and reject science? Do we abandon them as a lost cause? And I think you actually answered that question as to how to approach it. And of going with, hey, we're here to help you with your problem, not to lecture.
There are some limits to that model, I think. A vaccine, there are studies that show that if you show a bigger pile of studies to someone who's anti-vaccine, the studies show that it's beneficial. It makes them more resistant.
Yeah,
it's one of the tough challenges. And there are those who would say, this gets to Brian's arena, to politics, that you need to just marginalize them. And there's some issues like, in California with measles, I think it was measles or chickenpox or something, where the community risk is just too great, and you just say you can't go to school if you're not vaccinated. So there are lines where it becomes a matter of law. It's really tough because of religious exemptions and the like. And I think it's a frontier. I don't think we really have good answers there yet.
Yeah.
I think conspiracy theorists were marginalized and really not listened to. I hate to bring up his name again. I feel like I've done nothing but talk about Donald Trump this entire hour. But Donald Trump himself is a conspiracy theorist in so many ways. And he's given voice to a lot of these theories. He's broadcast them out there and boosted them and given some of these theories a legitimacy that they would normally never have.
Yeah, that's a good point.
There was a study just came out just yesterday showing that Donald Trump is the single largest source of misinformation in the global news coverage on the virus.
I saw that. I was wondering I saw that yesterday. I was going to bring it up about where the sources are. We have just a few minutes left, and what I'd like to do is to ask each of you just to maybe give me 2 or 3 points to sum up this, and I'm going to start in reverse order. Andy?
I guess a key to me is reflecting my own journey, moving from thinking the solution in these cases is a better story to pursuing a better conversation over and over, especially with wicked, enduring issues like climate change, like this pandemic, which is not going away anytime soon. And we're in an age of pandemic risk, that making sure there's a two-way, actually omnidirectional approach to communication, that the key definition of communication in the dictionary is exchange of information. It's not message. And that's a key. The other thing is those who really still are the gatekeepers of the online media environment have a huge amount of work to do. Facebook, YouTube is owned by Google, so Google, Facebook, Twitter, they're toying with capacities for tamping down the truly dangerous misinformation, and that's still early days as well. I think the one thing I want to emphasize is that agencies like the WHO, when you look at the budget they have for social media, and remember, it's not just putting out a tweet, it's monitoring social media in the context of pandemic risk. They're tiny levels of funding. Climate change, 0.16%, 0.16% of the research money that goes to climate has gone to social science and behavioral science. It's a fraction of a fingernail of the landscape of what we invest in when we think about climate change research. And that has to change. So those are two big things. And listening and conversation.
Great, thank you. I think really good points. Brian?
I spoke at the start about how I had an idea of what 2020 would look like. It looked nothing like I thought it would be. I thought it would just be election. I will make the point, the issues of coronavirus, issues of climate change, they would still exist whether or not we had Donald Trump in the White House and whether or not we had all of this focus on those issues right now. What has changed, I think, in 2020 is because of who we currently have in the White House and his relationship with science. And this goes back many years. You know, he was once quoted as saying that he thought climate change was a hoax. We know he pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Accord. And I think we saw that reflected in his handling of the coronavirus as well. A questioning of science, a lack of belief in some elements of science, but also a manipulation of science and taking the bits of the science that suited him. It has upped the ante, I think, for the scientists to communicate the way that they communicate, and up the ante on us, the journalists, to cover that. It has challenged us all. It has maybe made us work a lot harder. And I think both science and journalism will hopefully come out of this the stronger and the better for it.
Great, thank you. Rita?
I think it would be very valuable to convey to the public, to make them understand that they are scientists and they make scientific decisions every single day, perhaps every single minute. If you make a decision to whether or not you shall go out on a day, you look at the sky, you look at whether it's light or dark, you look at the prospects of whether your experience has told you it might rain or not rain, you choose to wear, according to the temperature, a raincoat or not, you are a scientist. You are collecting data and you are interpreting it and you are making a decision. And so I think if we could have everyone understand that science is really gathering data, interpreting it, and making decisions from it fundamentally, and that we are all scientists, and that what we need to be doing is broadening our experience and visage as to the kinds of larger global decisions that we all must participate in and collectively come to conclusions. So we're all scientists.
I agree. And I think from this fascinating discussion, which to me was just fascinating and really enjoyable, thank you. I think there's three takeaways that I got from it, just three words. One is conversation, to exchange conversation and to have more discussions, more to and fro, more listening, more speaking. The second is community. And that comes back to what you were saying, Rita, is that we are all scientists and that scientists are also part of their community, that we are scientists, we are citizens. And the third is responsibility, which you brought up, Brian, which is responsibility of all of us, scientists and citizens, to bring out information and to act responsibly and to speak responsibly. So on that note, I want to thank all of our three panelists for an amazing discussion, IASF, the embassy in DC, And I look forward to having you all back and to continuing this discussion. Thank you to everybody who tuned in from the US and from Ireland, and for your great comments and questions. Sorry I couldn't get to them all, but there'll be another time. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful evening, wonderful day. Take care.
Same to you. Thank
Stay
you.
safe. Bye-bye.
Cheers.